So Jon Stewart is back. He has a new show. I think it's a show with Apple or something. He went on CNN to talk about that and talk about the news of the day. And this is an interesting exchange with Jake Tapper, where he kind of tells him, like, stop over-focusing on Trump.
And you were talking a second ago about identifying the weak points in the guardrails of democracy. It's also obvious, and I know you've spoken about this in the past, that Donald Trump has also identified those weak points. He is now endorsing candidates for Secretary of State in battleground states, candidates who are all in on the big lie in Arizona.
I think we make a mistake focusing this all on Donald Trump as though he's, I don't know, Magneto and some incredible supervillain that has changed the very nature and temperature of the United States. Like, he's just been an effective vessel. But again, like, he's not singing new songs. This is something, he's maybe singing them a little better than, Goldwater. But I think it's a mistake to focus it all on this one individual and not to focus it more on, the idea that power is its own reward, whether it be in the financial industry or in government. Like, power doesn't cede itself. And unless we can figure out a better way to balance that power for, for workers and voters and different groups, we'll be vulnerable. I don't know that autocracy is purely the domain of Donald Trump. I think that we all have a bit of a tendency to be like, to grant amnesty to people that are doing things that we would prefer, even if that means that they're slightly undemocratic. There's many times where I think to myself, like, just do an executive order, for God's sake, just get it done. So I think our focus unhealthily on this one individual comes at the price of systems and dynamics that have been in place long before this cat ever learned how to surf those waves.
I think that what's going on is, it turns out, and we've learned a lot of this in recent decades, but especially maybe the last 4 or 5 years, because Donald Trump was so disruptive and so willing to challenge norms, we've learned that a lot of the American system is built on the honor system. And that only works, of course, if you care about or even have a sense of honor. And I know that that you're not so much concerned about an autocracy taking root as you are in the minority party figuring out how to rule, despite the fact that they do not enjoy majority support.
I think there's always been the danger that a minority of voices would have a majority of power. I mean, in a lot of ways, that's baked into the way that the system was created and enacted. And I just think in general, coming up with remedies to that have proven to be really difficult, because the larger issues is, we've elevated money and corporate power to this one level. We've diminished sort of pure democratic power to another level, and we're wildly out of balance.
That was fascinating to watch. So that's like the second or third time that I've seen that clip, and I actually got more out of it each time, because I just noticed Tapper was sort of not capable of digesting the point and listening to what Jon Stewart was saying and getting it. So he says, listen, don't overfocus on Trump. You're looking at him like he's a supervillain or like Magneto. Quote, he's not singing a new song. He's not singing a new song. So you know what that means? He's a demagogue, and demagogues throughout history have existed, and they've tried to channel somewhat justified rage to their own personal, greedy, narcissistic, power-hungry ends. And so he references Barry Goldwater, who tried to do it. Pat Buchanan is another one who was Trump before Trump came up. He says, quote, power doesn't cede itself. We need to give workers and voters. He even says boaters, which is kind of hilarious that he said that. We need to give workers and boaters and regular people a say that they currently don't have. And then the most important points are, he says, quote, you focus on this individual instead of the system, and we've elevated money and corporate power. See, that's the problem. The problem isn't just Trump, and just to be clear, Trump, of course, is a problem. He's a huge problem, and he's his own unique problem in a sense, but the real problem was the groundwork that was laid which brought us to Donald Trump. The real problem was the complete and utter institutional failure of a system that was so broken that there was even a remote possibility that we could get a Donald Trump who won and became president. Think about how reviled our institutions must be for a guy like Trump to end up winning. A guy who's a clear charlatan, conman, fraud, blowhard, but a lot of people said, you know what, let's roll the dice because at least he is a message to the establishment that we're not taking this anymore. It's a brick through the window. Now, fundamentally, Donald Trump ended up serving the establishment because he's a charlatan and a con man and a fraud. But the real issue is the groundwork that was laid well before Trump got into power. I mean, it really goes back to probably the Reagan era. Everything that happened from then and on, which led to Donald Trump. So you had the Republican Party totally sold out, bought and owned by corporate America and the military-industrial complex. But then you have the Democratic Party, the new Democratic coalition, which decided, hey, that seems like a good way to raise a lot of money for our campaigns. So why don't we act half like the Republicans? And the Democratic Party no longer was the party of workers. It also became the party of Wall Street and Big Pharma and the military-industrial complex. And then you got Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton's biggest accomplishments were all Republican ideas. Welfare reform, which gutted welfare. The repealing of Glass-Steagall, which was a massive deregulation of banking that had separated commercial banking and investment banking. They said, no, let's get rid of that. So we had this casino capitalist system where regular depositor money was blown by speculative investors. And of course, we had the giant crash. You had George W. Bush, who also deregulated, also cut taxes for the rich. Donald Trump did the same thing. Barack Obama, unfortunately, in many ways, was a continuation of that broken system. He didn't deviate much from it. I mean, his healthcare reform was a former right-wing idea. Came from the Heritage Foundation, a right-wing think tank. So the problem is corporations and billionaires have totally bought the system, and they own the system, and they own the politicians, and they rig the rules against workers and in their favor. So unions absolutely obliterated. Wages completely stagnant. Taxes low for the wealthy, high for the working class. Healthcare system totally for-profit scam on top of a scam within a scam. At every level, the system is completely corrupted, disgusting, rotten, and broken. And so Trump came up and postured as an outsider populist who also fed on xenophobia and bigotry. And the country was ripe for that because everybody was hurting, so that he was scapegoating, and it worked. And Jake Tapper can't help but keep going back to Trump's the main problem. So the main problem with what Jake Tapper is saying is that there's this underlying implication of his arguments that if we just go back to the pre-Trump era, well, that's when everything was relatively okay. But it wasn't, Jake. What came before Trump is the groundwork that led to Trump. So if you want to go back to what it was like just before Trump, there's going to be another kind of Trump that comes up. And maybe the next one will be even worse. So that's Jon Stewart's point. He's like, you need to focus on the system. The problem is we elevated money and corporate power, and then that led to a demagogue taking advantage of that. And instead of wanting to fix the underlying situation that brought us Trump, you just want to hyper-focus on Trump like he's the only problem. Now, by the way, I'm not saying he's not a problem. Of course, he's a massive problem. And in some ways, he's a unique problem because he did, you know, any sort of norms and rules that were in place, he violated what remained of them. Now, by the way, they were largely ignored previously, like by George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, the neocons, but he went even further with it, you know, denying the outcome of an election which has been proven that Biden won. I mean, they had over 60 court cases over it, and Donald Trump lost almost every single one. There's no evidence. Even with the audit that they did in Arizona, it said Biden won by even more. So he is a problem, and he is in many ways a unique problem, and that stuff does need to be called out. The problem with mainstream media is that's all they know how to do. You just call out Trump. That's it. They don't know how to talk about the underlying problems which led to Trump and the broken system because, by the way, they're beneficiaries of that system as well. They're an elite group with no accountability whatsoever. They've been wrong on virtually every major political question in the last 4 decades. And Jon Stewart's sort of holding a mirror up to him and saying, you keep focusing on this guy like he's Magneto, like he's a supervillain. He's not singing a new song. He's a demagogue. He's a charlatan. We've had them throughout time. You need to question why it is that the charlatan actually got power this time. Why did he actually win? Why did it actually work this time? Maybe because the system is more broken than it's ever been. The problem is we've elevated money and corporate power. The problem is the corruption of the system. The problem is it's rigged against regular people, and regular people know it, so they're reaching for any kind of answer they could possibly get, even if it's a wrong answer. That's better in their mind than a perpetuation of the status quo, which is exactly what Hillary Clinton represented. Now, in the 2020 election, people realized, Trump's a fraud too, and so it was just a sort of a backlash election. I'm not voting for Biden, I'm just voting against Trump. But we still have all of those underlying problems, and CNN is totally incapable of dealing with that question in a serious and honest way. And Jon Stewart, as per usual, is leagues beyond them. So wonderful job here from Jon Stewart. I think he's right. CNN, MSNBC, they over-focus on Trump. You see more Trump stories on CNN and MSNBC than you see Biden stories, and Biden's president. He's the one that has the power right now. And by the way, guess what? Final point on this. The media is going to end up doing what they did in 2016, which is they can't help themselves. They keep talking about Trump. It helps them with their ratings, and they just have this obsession. In 2016, that's one of the things that led to him winning, is they couldn't shut the fuck up about him. And now you could say, well, Kyle, it was negative press. It wasn't positive press, so shouldn't that have hurt Trump? Only if you're good at doing the negative press, and they're not good at doing the negative press. So in a weird way, there's a backlash effect, and sometimes it helps them. So they're going to end up bringing to fruition the thing they don't want the most, which is Trump maybe getting to power again. So, Jon Stewart absolutely nailed it. I'm glad he's back. I'm glad he has a new show. I don't agree with the guy on everything, but he's way, way better than any of the morons who are on cable news. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.